I think we can make a start, Martha. What do you think?
Yes, I think we can. Right. So, hello, everybody. Very happy to be here. My name is Marta Hernandez. I'm with Nonviolent Peace Force here in South Sudan. I'm connected from Juba. So welcome to this session on decolonizing UCP and accompaniment. So before we start, I would like to give the word to Austin for some technical housekeeping information. Austin?
Thank you, Martha, and hello, good day to everyone. Interpretation services are available during this session. Please select the language in which you would like to hear the session, and this can be accessed by selecting the interpretation button on the bottom of your Zoom window next to the globe icon. And this instruction includes English speakers. If you're most comfortable speaking and listening in English, select English. And for all languages, please speak in the language you are most comfortable using in this workshop. I'll be providing technical support during this session. The session is being recorded and the recording will be shared on the Lumio discussion site. With that in mind, if you do not want your video to be shared, you can turn off your video by selecting the Stop Video button in the lower left corner. Because it's being recorded, only communicate information you are comfortable sharing publicly. When you're not speaking, please select the mute button in the lower left corner. Doing so will mute your audio to help preserve audio quality for everyone. Select Unmute to provide audio when you're speaking. Please ensure that your name displayed on Zoom is accurate. To change your Zoom name, click the 3 dots in the upper right corner of your display and select Rename. Use the Raise Hand feature in the Participants tab to be called on to make a comment or a question. If you do not see this feature, please reach out to me directly over chat. Make sure that you send the chat to me specifically instead of to the entire group. You may also reach out to me with any other technical questions. That's all that I have, and I hope that you have an excellent workshop.
Great. Thank you, Austin. So let's now turn to the topic of this session, decolonizing UCP and accompaniment. In the regional workshop that preceded this virtual gathering, it became very obvious that most UCP and accompaniment organizations share a commitment to putting local actors first. Many organizations also explicitly consider questions of race, ethnicity, and other protected characteristics in the way they organize themselves and engage with others. But as the inputs into our well-consumed session have also raised, some central concerns remain. On the one hand, as Peter Doherty reminded us, there is the question or dilemma of white and northern privilege, which seems to work as a powerful leverage for protection, while at the same time, it reproduces global power structures that produce violences in the first place. On the other hand, as Sam Taylor reminded us, these power structures are everywhere. They produce violences everywhere, and they affect people on a personal level as well. This means that perhaps we need to rethink practices of UCP to include practices of care more centrally. Against the background of these observations, we formulated some basic questions to approach this topic. So these questions are UCP and accompaniment strategies dependent on global inequalities? If so, does UCP accompaniment reproduce the various structures that cause structural and physical violence in the first place? How do colonizing practices and structures intersect with other inequalities? And what can be done to decolonize the practice of UCP and accompaniment? To start discussing these questions, in this session, we will first have the opportunity to listen to 5 speakers who have been thinking about them for a while and who will share their ideas and experiences with us. We will then break out into smaller groups and invite everyone to participate in the discussion. So what is it that we are expecting as an outcome of this session? So we hope that this session will be the starting point for a longer conversation, that it will raise awareness of the topic with those who might not yet have thought much about decolonizing UCP, and that it will give insights into the different challenges to and practices of decolonizing UCP that may exist in different contexts. Berit, over to you.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you so much. Thanks for this introduction. Before I hand over to our 5 speakers, just to mention that I think every workshop I have been to so far in this virtual gathering has at some point or another come to the point of mentioning global power structures, questions of decolonization. Yesterday, for example, there was the umbrella UCP accompaniment umbrella session, which was about finding out what brings kind of, or what brings organizations together and what holds them apart, where Milena Rincon, for example, from CPT Columbia, talked about the question of whether nonviolence sometimes could turn perhaps into a form of oppression if we don't develop it further and rethink all the time what it means. Or one of the breakout groups in that session, which also pointed to these larger structures that maintain and may keep especially global North and global South partners apart, including who's responsible for the large parts of climate change and climate chaos and so on. And even if you think about the name of this virtual gathering, so we always talk about Anam-Syrian protection and accompaniment, and this is because organizations who are present here use these words quite differently, and some, for example, reject the term protection because they find it patronizing, and they rather talk about being with and accompanying. So I think there's a lot here in all of the sessions, and I'm so happy that we have 5 super speakers who have thought about this question already and who will get us started to talk about and to think about it. So I would like to introduce our first speaker to you. I'm really happy that she agreed to speak to us today. Our first speaker is Shannon Paige. Shannon is a policy associate working at Peace Direct, and she leads Peace Direct's research and advocacy efforts around decolonizing the aid and peace building system. Now, Peace Direct has recently published a report titled Time to Decolonize Aid, and there's a Loom, on the Lumio discussion board, there's a link to this report as well that I've put there. I can show you later on where to find it so you can read it. And Shannon is the main author of this report. So I really look forward to your insights from your work on this in the aid sector. Over to you, Shannon.
Thank you so much, Berit. And firstly, I'd like to say hello, everybody. Good morning for me, good afternoon for many of you, and good evening for a number of you still. I am currently in New York, and I am just going to share a little bit about some of the conversations that I've been a part of around what it means to really think about these global power dynamics. And so first and foremost, a little bit about the research that Peace Direct undertook last November, oh my goodness, over a year now. Last November, we organized a 3-day online consultation with practitioners from across the globe talking about power dynamics, structural racism, and what it means to decolonize. And really some of the key findings that came out of those systems was this notion, and I think for this group, which is most useful, is this idea that we, as the peace building sector, we are not neutral and we are not apolitical, and that we are part of a larger history that we really need to be willing and ready to contextualize ourselves within. And I think that's really difficult for a lot of people to grapple with, because the history that we're being asked to contextualize ourselves within is a history of colonialism, colonization, and slavery. And so how are we as the peace building sector understanding that we emerge from this lineage, that there are practices, norms that we have that are directly resulting from those periods? And so I think for that, these 3 questions that have been brought to us today are such heavy ones. And I think I'm going to try and make sure that my intervention isn't too long, because the most interesting part after all of my other speakers have had a chance to speak is going to be the questions. So really, to think about it, are these strategies dependent on global inequalities? And the answer is yes. As we talked about, as mentioned at the start of this session, What is it that affords protection by our presence? It's the fact that many of us hold citizenship from countries in the global north, be it, the United States, or be it Europe or other countries, and or that we are affiliated with organizations that are imbued with a degree of legitimacy and a degree of relevancy on the global stage. That means that people are looking at us. So if I, my family's originally from the Caribbean, if I was a small organization in Trinidad and I thought that it was our responsibility as global citizens to go to a country that is experiencing conflict, to accompany those people and try and diffuse those situations, would my presence bring any more safety if I had no other affiliation than being from Trinidad? No, because there is no power in that title. Because if a small group of people from a small community in a country that is not globally, quote unquote, relevant, there is no real protection. And so how can we, as those of us involved in unarmed civilian protection and accompaniment, how can we sit with that uncomfortable truth that the only reason, one of the primary ways that we are useful is leveraging our own positionalities? And I think that then brings into question, who is an effective and most useful accompanier? Does it have to be somebody who is phenotypically white? Because for many communities, even though I hold US citizenship, I can show up and they won't perceive me as American. And so is it somebody who is phenotypically white? Is it somebody who, has access to media on a global stage? What does it mean to accompany? And what does it mean to sit with our own positionality as we do so? And I think I really want to focus the bulk of my intervention on the second question, which is really what Peace Direct has been digging into for the past however many months, which is, how do these colonizing practices and structures intersect with other inequalities? Now, I think something that is really challenging is the fact that we need to sit with the truth that not only do many, if not most, of these inequalities intersect with colonizing practices, but to separate them is to do a disservice and is in fact to isolate the nature of these inequalities. To understand patriarchy as its own system without understanding the ways that, male domination was constructed during the colonial process is to not truly understand patriarchy, is not to truly understand the way that we replicate those systems. Similarly, to not reflect on the ways that we as a global society at this point privilege and prioritize whiteness over any other racial demographic, is to not understand that these things didn't just emerge. They're not inherent to us as people. They're not inherent to any particular community. These are powerful norms and structures that were constructed during the colonial period and that continue to impact us today. And so how can we make sure that we're aware of that? I think for many years, when we think about violence, we think about it as separate from colonization, but how can we truly understand it as an ongoing continued legacy? There are many communities, many spaces that I've had the privilege of being in where we're having these conversations and thinking about them, not as a separate thing from colonization, but in fact, a perpetuation of colonization. And so what does that look like when we start to sit with this? What does it look like when we wonder, what does it mean to really accompany and protect the LGBTQ community, a community that so many groups are so often comfortable allowing not be protected? What does that look like? How can we understand ourselves? How can we make sure that we are really in community, in solidarity, walking with people who are experiencing conflict, rather than asserting ourselves and asserting our own values onto those communities? And I think the final thing that I want to end with before I transition over to some of my fellow speakers is this final question of what can be done. And during the consultation, a number of participants shared that they felt really aware of the ways that they were perceived by those in the global north. Specifically Muslim women were sharing stories of really being aware that many people experience them as victims rather than ever as agents for change. And so how that then felt disempowering for many of them, because from the get-go, the relationship that is being built is one where the external person to the context is engaging with you as somebody in need of assistance, somebody in need of something intrinsic that only this external person can bring. How can we recognize the skills and the talents and the abilities of the communities that we are accompanying? How can we really make sure that when we are accompanying people, it isn't us saying, here we have the answers and we are here to quote unquote save you, but rather we are here are our hands, here is our time, here are our resources. Where do you need us? And what does this look like? Thank you, everybody. And I'm really looking forward to having a further conversation with everyone today.
Thanks so much, Shannon. Thanks for kicking us off in this lovely way. Super, let's move on to the next speaker right away. Our next speaker then is, let me have a look on my list here, Rexall Kaalim, who's joining us from the Philippines. Rexall is a Bangsamoro leader and serves as an assistant program manager and safety and security coordinator of nonviolent peace force in the Philippines. Rexall, I hope you're there and the floor is yours.
I'm here. Thank you, Berit, and good evening to everyone. Good morning to others, and good afternoon to others. Well, in the Philippine context, I can say that the first question, whether UCP and accompaniment strategies depend on global north. In the Philippines, I think we're one of having the most active civil society movements. If you know that we moved out the president in 1986, no? Through the people power movement in the Philippines. So I think it did not affect us. Before international organizations, accompanier came, like in the middle of year 2000, 2007 to be exact, like NP is the first international accompanier that who came here. We were already organized. There are already local organizations doing accompaniment, doing protective accompaniment, doing civilian peacekeeping. You know? I was one of those who first organized these kinds of movements in the communities. And though at some point international accompaniers have strengthened our positions, but it's not dependent on that. No, we have some accompaniers even before NP came, because my organization before was the one who invited NP to come, because we see we see also the strength of having international accompaniers in our advocacy, you know, to better protect civilians. I think that's one, and there are also concrete examples that just recently during the Marawi siege, international staff of NP were not allowed inside Marawi. Only our national staff, me and some other local staff, were allowed to do rescue of the victims inside, you know, the most affected areas at the height of the Marawi siege in 2017. So because internationals at that context will not be effective, no, and that's one. And so I can say also that when we say about women activism here in the Philippines, in 2008, when the civilian protection component was institutionalized by both the government and the More Islamic Liberation Front, one of the organizations, because NP was one of the organizations that was invited to be part of that mechanism, peace process mechanism, a peacekeeping mechanism, a formal mechanism. There is another civil society organization that organized an all-women contingent, and at the time also they were like really advocating for the implementation of UN Security Resolution 1325, no? And they're very active until now. They have an existing organization, they call it Women Engaging Action in 1325, or We Act, no? And in that sense, at that time, it is 2008, and they're already advancing that, no, that women participation in peacekeeping and peace and security. And for nonviolent peace force, in terms of responding to how we do these practices in terms of gender, no? In terms of gender, I think the response of nonviolent peace for Philippines during the Marawi siege in Lanao, particularly, you know, in terms of accompanying the survivors, because we're the only allowed, no? Only national staff are allowed, only national organizations also are allowed to intervene. So doing this, ensuring that survivor-centered and human rights-centered approach in the intervention are provided, that we're not only like looking into protection, but we're ensuring that recurrence of violence against women will not happen. No? And that's I think that's one of the strategies that being employed by time, engaging also formal institutions, mandated institutions of the government and other international aid agencies in ensuring that the survivors are attended to well. No? In terms of how we decolonize, I said that there are already very active women organizations here and participation in actions, especially on women, peace and security. Now, the focus of programming on NP is more on how we enhance and strengthen more women's participation in community peace protection mechanisms, like in the early warning, early response structures that we're organizing in the conflict-affected communities. We encourage the participation and involvement of women and youth in these structures, as well as our capacity building in terms of ensuring that women survivors also protect other women, no? affected in the conflict. We know that it is a challenge, but we're already doing it, and now we're engaging even more, no? In terms of transforming women, no? Women to protect women, no? Even those who had been involved in the violence. Like, for example, there are interventions to how we reintegrate or transform women combatants of the More Islamic Liberation Front to communities to be more productive in communities in advocating for gender equality, for more participation in peace building. You know, that's what we are focusing now on our programming, women, peace, and security. I think that's all I can share, and then we look forward. I'm looking forward for more discussions, interactions during the question and answer.
Thank you so much.
Session.
Yes, thank you so much, Rexall, and thank you for reminding us so strongly that, of course, there are already organizations there doing a lot of work before even any accompaniers arrived upon any invitation, and also when they are there. Of course, the civil society is super active, and accompaniment is not the only thing that is happening. So yeah, I think very important. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I'll take you on a virtual journey now from the Philippines to South Sudan, from where Moses John is joining us, who's our next speaker. Moses is a nonviolent action activist, a trainer and researcher, and he's also a co-founder and the executive director of the Organization for Nonviolence and Development, which is based in Juba in South Sudan. Moses, over to you, please. Are you there? There's so many people on my screen here. If you're there, please unmute you and speak. Where are you? There you are. You have to unmute yourself first. Yes.
Okay. Yes. Okay. Thank you so much, Britt, for the introduction and moderation of this session. I'm very honored to be part of these discussions. As actually South Sudan, as far as I know, actually has recorded the success of NP's work globally. And I think of recent, South Sudan was actually the biggest mission of NP global, as far as I know. I stand to be corrected. And so I'm very happy to join this conversation, because discussing some of those issues that we really felt is important to be discussed, issues of protection, accompaniment, but also issues of race, ethnicity, and colonization are very crucial when it comes to, envisioning success of our program in decades to come. And so discussing those questions is also, in my view, a way that we as practitioners, we don't really want it to be part of the problem, but we want it to be part of the solution. Because as we contribute in providing or helping people to provide protection for themselves, we are part and partial of the context. And therefore, we need to reflect on our work from time to time to ensure that we are on the right track and that we are able to deter some of the temptations that might actually implicate our work. And so the good news, as far as I am seeing, is that we are working towards how do we make our work actually better and have the best possible impact in the long run. I'm very happy because in 2008, I was actually a volunteer in Croatia, in a small town called Osijek. And in that small town, I was actually an international protection and peace worker being deployed by the Civil Peace Service in Germany. In that small organization in Croatia, the Center for Peace, Nonviolence, and Human Rights. And as part of that internship program, I have learned a lot because, first of all, when I arrived the city, the context of the city, I've been reading about it, but reading about the city is one thing, being part and partial of that community is another. And so I was prepared. I went with open heart. I knew I was learning as much as I am there to help the local community, to help protect themselves. So the community I was working with was the Roma community. And most of you might know that the Roma community, they are original, I think, from India, but they have been moving from one country in Europe to another. And normally when they arrive in a country, they live in a very deplorable situation. Some live actually under bridges, and others live in some shanty areas, which exposes them to a lot of risk, including security risk. And therefore, the need for protection becomes very, very important for this kind of community. And so I was actually working with that community, particularly the youth, but also the elderly, both men and women. And I've learned so much from them. And they keep on asking me, why are you here? And why do you think it is interesting to work with our community and so forth? And it was an opportunity for me to share my story. By then, Southern Sudan was still part of Sudan. So I told them I also come from a conflict-affected region or country. And therefore, I have also stories of what it means that to protect ourselves. And I was able to share our stories. How do we, as people, contribute in making sure that we provide protection to ourselves? So I told them, look, I am not bringing anything new. I am not even coming to protect you, but I'm coming to share this story with you. How did we manage to protect ourselves as community? Because we don't have arms, but how do we manage to protect ourselves as community? And therefore, sharing those stories actually was, some of them said, well, we seem to be doing almost similar things. And others said, well, perhaps the context in Europe is slightly different. And I totally agree with them. On the other side, in that context, I have also established and built relationship. It's starting right from where I lived, in the apartment. And I still remember even the neighbors, particularly particularly the youth and the children.
I think I may have lost the sound. Am I the only one? Sorry.
Oh, I think we lost.
I
Some
can't
issues.
hear either, Barrett.
Okay, Moses, we lost your sound somehow. We can still see you, but the last 3 sentences or so, we couldn't hear you. Say something to see whether it works again. No, weirdly enough, we can't hear you anymore. Ah, you don't hear me
Right.
either.
Yeah.
Ooh, that's maybe, I don't know, Austin, is there something we can do about this or find out about?
Yeah, I'm corresponding over a private chat with Moses, working to resolve this. So let's see. If it's a bandwidth issue, perhaps turning off, if Moses just turns off his video and it's just an audio exchange, it may be more supported in that way. If we try that.
Yeah, we can try that. Can you still not hear us, Moses? Otherwise, I mean, while you try to figure it out, what we could do is move on and come back to Moses when the sound is back. Is that an option, Austin?
It is. I can exercise host privileges and turn off Moses's video now if we want to just try that so that we don't have to jump back and forth.
Yeah, we can try it.
All right, Moses, if you can hear me, I'm going to stop your video just for the sake of trying to get your audio through.
Can you hear us now, Moses? Is this any better? It doesn't seem to work. Maybe if he leaves the meeting and comes back, sometimes that helps. And in the meantime, I would say we just carry on with the next speaker.
Sure.
But what I take from Moses so far is this amazing story of somebody from South Sudan, or what was that at that point a part of Sudan still, going to Croatia to share his story and to protect people there, which I think is a great example of how kind of South-North accompaniment can also work. It would be lovely to hear the end of his learning from that. So let's then move on while Austin tries to solve the technical issues there. Our next speaker is Tejan Lamboi. Tejan is an anti-racism and diversity trainer, and he consults for different NGOs as workshop facilitator on the question of being aware of colonial continuity and privileges, white privileges, probably also others in the context of international development work. And he has worked with organizations in Germany and Sierra Leone. Tejan, without much further ado, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And I just want to add that currently I also work with Bundesverteiler Verteidigung, which is also, I think, part of the organizing team at Bildungsreferent, or how do you say that in German?
Probably a trainer or an educator, something like that.
Yeah, for a project against racism and violence, which is also connected to what we're discussing here today. And I have to say, Barrett, when you sent these questions, I was like, my God, what are they asking us to do? How can we find answers to these questions in 5-8 minutes? Finding answers to these questions, if that is at all possible, means that we have to go back 500 years of the history of enslavement, of colonialism, of oppression, of Ausbeutung. What is Ausbeutung again?
Exploitation.
Exploitation, exactly. Which is very, very difficult. And thank you very much that I had this few times, and also to the previous speakers who've said, I think, most of the things I had in mind to talk about. The question again is, where do I begin? Where do we begin when we talk about decolonizing unarmed civilian peacekeeping? And the question also is, are we really unarmed? Are we doing peacekeeping? When we go to countries that have suffered or are continuing to suffer from this global inequality and oppression, which is not stopping, and to which we are also part of, what is our role? How do we contribute to creating more violence? How do we contribute to creating systems that make people dependent? Maybe if I would attempt to answer these questions as in bulk, I would say it's about power. When we talk about decolonizing, we talk about giving power or giving up power. And you would agree with me that giving up power is not something anyone, not any human being is ready to do. And what is power in the first place and in this context? And probably I want to answer that question by going back to what the Nigerian writer Chimamanda Adichie sees as the meaning of power. That is the ability not only to tell the story of another person or people, but to make it the definitive story of those people or of that person. No? Are we asking ourselves the question when we do peacekeeping, is that not what we are doing? When we think we need to help people, we need to go somewhere to help people. Are we not in a way implying that these people are helpless? That is in itself a reason which was used to justify colonialism, you know. And I think that's what we all do. And I come from the global south. I'm from Sierra Leone. I was born and raised there. And I think I'm also living here very long. And I think I'm part of this global web of or system or framework. And because I work also in this context quite a lot. And what I want to actually talk about very briefly in the next minutes is, I think, when we talk about decolonizing peacekeeping or whatever we're doing, I think it starts with ourselves. I think maybe you discussed this already lengthily in other workshops you had, but I think we have to start with decolonizing ourselves. That's the very, very first step. And how do we decolonize ourselves? I think we have to understand our social positioning in this global web of exploitation and violence, because it's also very violent. No? The best way maybe to start with that is to have a really intersectional perspective. I mean, you talked already a little bit about the world we are living in, which is very, very macho, which is very male dominated. Maybe I don't want to go into that. I want to focus a little bit probably on race, because I think race is also very, very important in this context. So when we talk about peacekeeping, when we talk about peacekeeping in this context, we often go back to countries that have been exploited and destroyed by racism, by colonialism, and all of this. So we need to be aware of the privileges, the positions we have in this system. And if we talk about race, we also have to understand that race has a very long history of oppression, which reinforces power. This means that if I have to focus a little bit also when I talk about race, I will not avoid to talk about white people, and I think white people in particular need to become aware of their responsibilities and privileges in this context. When we talk about decolonizing UCP, I think we must talk about power, languages, and speaking. We must ask who is not heard in this system, in this global system, who decides what, who is silenced, who is muzzled. And finally, when we talk about power in this context, we also don't mean the powerful, whatever that means. We mean ourselves, everyone who is seated here now. All of you, we are very powerful. we are the privileged, no? We who speak, we who give workshops, like myself, we who are the experts, no? We who are differently privileged on different levels and have a responsibility for our actions. I think if we want to answer the question about how do we go further, what do we do, what do we need to do? I always talk about the concept of power sharing. What does that mean? It sounds maybe like another buzzword. We've been talking for I don't know how many years about empowerment and everything. That in itself sounds also very paternalistic, no? And now we talk about power sharing. Well, what does that mean? No? Power sharing means for me to listen to people who are the experts, who have been oppressed for so long, no? In our missions, in our whatever we're doing. And we might think that this is very simple. We think we listen, but we don't really listen. Because I think if we do listen, we would be doing a lot of things differently. We would be focusing more of our work here, asking our governments, asking questions to our structures on why these conflicts in the first place going on, instead of going to these places to try to address not the causes, but like the symptoms of this conflict. I think we are not listening enough. That's very important. And power sharing also means for me, it's not about speaking for others. When we go as peacekeepers, and it's not our responsibility to speak for others. People could speak for themselves. And I think that's also very, very important in this context. And being aware of our privileges and how we contribute sometimes in a violent way, even though we think we are doing good, even though we think we are good people, is also very important. Very lastly, before I stop, I think it's also important to note that in this context, it's about to understand and allow people to have their own spaces, and spaces where you don't have to have access to, even though you think you're doing something good, people should deny. No, you don't have to access this space. Is that what we're doing? Are people always consenting to us invading their spaces in our work? We might think yes, because based on this system again that has created these inequalities, we have the resources and we come with the resources, and people of course would never say no. But are they really willing to let us access those spaces? And I think these are all questions we have to reflect on in a very deep way. It's not something new. And that's why it's sometimes very, very painful when we all sit again together and we discuss these questions, we discuss these issues over and again, over and again, over and again. But at the end of the day, we are not listening. And we think we might be listening, we think we might understand, but we are not listening, because listening also means, if I go back to where I started, giving up power, because we're used to people listening to us. We are not used to it happening the other way around, you know, and that means we have to give up power. And so the end of it all, if we put everything together, I think for me at the end of the day, to answer all these questions is about power and the willingness to give up power. And I think the readiness is not there, and that's very painful, if I would say, and that's also in itself very, very violent. And yes, since we don't have so much time, I will stop for now. And I think this is, I mean, you've been doing also workshops on these topics. I think it should continue, because I think it's very important. We should have enough time to talk about these issues. And by talking about them, we are reminding ourselves, which is very, very important. And why I find this forum very useful, although the time is very, very short. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much, Tejan. And obviously we're aware that an hour and a half cannot solve 500 years of colonization, but I think it's great to have this conversation. If you look into the chat, there's so many people who have said, yes, everything he says, and I totally agree here. So yeah, thanks so much for reminding us of really working on what listening actually means, and bringing in your concept of power sharing. Somehow it almost kind of comforts me to think, if we have to start with ourselves, there's also something that can be done. So it's not about changing all the structures out there. If the structures are in us, we can start with ourselves. I think we all can probably do that. So it's some sort of hope in what you say as well, which is great. So thanks for that. I'll try, I think Moses has joined us again, and I'll try to see whether we are actually connected now. Moses, if you're back in the meeting, could you try and come back in and see if your sound is working? Oh, I hear
yes,
sound.
I am back. Yes, the internet is a bit misbehaving now. But actually, let me try to summarize what I wanted to say. Super. Is that the future of UCP and accompaniment is in the local ownership and youth, working with the youth. And that's actually what I wanted to summarize that. And I totally agree with my colleague who have just spoken that conflict and violence are all, power is at the center of every conflict, almost every conflict and violence. And therefore, if we are to deal with issues of violence, we should be ready to work on issues of, sorry for that. The kids, actually, they came and they wanted to talk as well. Yes, so actually my contribution is on how do we decolonize the UCP. My suggestions are the following. One, we need to work with and not for the local communities. That's very important. And I know we are, actually some of us, if not all, are actually working with this concept, working with rather than working for the local community. Because if we talk of protection, how do we protect the local community without them contributing in their own protection? It's not possible, because there is no way that someone can protect me if I am not a key stakeholder in the process of protection itself, you see. So the local community should actually be the driving force. They should be the key partners, not beneficiaries. They should be the key partners and not beneficiaries. Because if they are beneficiaries, they are only service recipients, And that idea of partner versus service recipient is actually a colonization idea. Because someone is having power, somebody is having resources and claiming to provide protection for the people. That cannot longer be accepted at our time. This is 2021. So we must get this very clear and get it in good faith. The second part is that we should put efforts to also learn, because as accompaniers, we should learn, because normally we are also strangers in the context. Just like my story of being in Osseck, an African man being in Osseck, working among the Roma people. What do you think I can do to protect these people? Almost nothing. But what I can do is, if I learn, I will then become part of that local community. And by being part of that local community, and by sharing my story and listening to their stories, we will be able to make peace to happen, you see. So it is actually about working in collaboration with the local communities. The other part is that we need to increase communication and engagement with local community, civil society, and other peace actors, including the government, you see, by increasing the communication. And here I meant the people and the local actors, they have their own perception about us. Some, unfortunately, do not understand what is our UCP all about. They don't understand. All they see is that they see our presence in conflict-affected areas. Some actually perceived us as spies. Others perceive us as human rights observers, because we don't talk. We are just there, we are providing protection, we don't talk. And actually others, some actually perceive us negatively. And so by increasing communication, we will help them understand that we are not here as spies, We are just here because we like to be part of this community and to work together with them in order to support the peace process at grassroots level. The other important aspect also is to focus on working with the youth. Because we know, for example, in South Sudan, the youth make about 73% of the total population. What does that mean? And even in Africa, for example, 75% of Africa's population of nearly 1.3 billion, actually they are the youth. They are below 35%. What does that mean? It means there's no way we can empower the local population to provide protection for themselves without engaging the youth, you see? And even more, the youth are the target groups that actually are being used by negative forces in order to perpetuate violence. So if we are able to work with the youth, and if the youth say no to violence, we will be able to secure a peaceful future for the local population. So these are the few actually contributions that I feel is very important to be echoed, that the future of UCP and accompaniment lies in the local ownership and also working with the youth in particular. And with that, I mean both girls and boys, women and men. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And I'm so glad the sound came back and we were able to hear this. So fantastic. Thank you so much, Moses. I would like to hand over to our final speaker in this round of speakers, Alison Wood. Alison is a facilitator, advocate, and educator rooted in the US-Mexico borderlands and has been working with Presbyterian Peace Fellowship, but also coordinated the Turks and Borderlands Young Adult Volunteer Program. Alison has also served as an accompanier in Colombia. I stop here and I hand over to you, Alison.
Thank you, Barrett. And thank you to all the panelists. I'm just sitting here, my brain buzzing with all this brilliance. I will start by saying a little bit more about my social location, which is that I am white and cisgender. I have a generally conforming gender presentation as a woman. I have a US passport, and I'm part of an organization, Presbyterian Peace Fellowship, that, just like Shannon was sharing, is deeply aligned with institutional power in the United States. It's a white, wealthy, we're affiliated with a white, wealthy, mainline Protestant denomination. And so I share all this to be clear that my heritage, my socialization, and my culture are all rooted in colonization. In many ways, I am a colonizer. I hold colonizing identities. I think that's important to name, both to be transparent and because that position shapes and limits my own understanding of decolonization. And I would say that I understand my audience to be, or the folks I'm hoping to speak really directly toward, the people who find that their identities are resonating with some of the things that I name. And that's important to name because part of decolonizing practice is for white people to speak less, and for, particularly in my context in the United States, for white people to understand that we don't have a lot to say on these issues, that our understanding and imagination is limited by our identities. So I want to say a little bit about some specific things that we've thought about in Presbyterian Peace Fellowship around these issues, responding to this question about are UCP and accompaniment strategies dependent on global inequalities, which I think we've heard clearly. The answer to that is yes, or is often yes. And this is one place where accompaniment, as Presbyterian Peace Fellowship practices it, is different from self-protection strategies that groups like Nonviolent Peace Force practice, that our whole model is dependent on sending accompaniers from the United States, from this position affiliated with institutional and military power, to places where we've been invited to accompany in the global South, specifically currently in the country of Colombia and on the US-Mexico border. here in Turtle Island. So we have to ask ourselves, if this is the model in which we're functioning, what are we doing to actually destabilize colonial white supremacist racial capitalist power dynamics? What are we doing to destabilize those interactions on the individual scale and on a larger scale? I think when I think about decolonization, I think about this movie, I think from the 90s called The Truman Show, which you may have seen, but if you're not familiar, the basic storyline is of a young man who is born and grows up living inside this dome, and his whole life is a TV show. And the kind of twist, so spoiler alert, the sort of twist of this movie is that he has grown up inside this dome encompassing his whole world, but he doesn't realize that it's a dome. He thinks that the whole world is around him, but it's just contained. And so for those of us, particularly who hold colonizing identities, colonization works this way, that we think we have access to the whole world, but actually our understanding, our imagination, the ways that we see and interact with the world are encompassed by colonization, and that's often not something that we recognize, our own limitations. So one more kind of concrete example of this limitation of colonized imagination is in the land back movement here in Turtle Island, which is the land that now comprises colonially called Canada and United States. So Indigenous leaders are talking about the land back movement, are leading this movement. And I often hear white people say, okay, but if I give my land back to the local tribe, where am I supposed to live? Which is a really shallow understanding of what we're after in decolonization, and illustrates how often when we think about decolonization, we're thinking about it from the standpoint of colonization. We're not questioning the foundational ideologies or assumptions that operate in these processes. I do think it's important to think about fractals, which is a framework that Adrienne Marie Brown proposes, that if we can do things in the small scale, we'll be able to create in the large scale the world that we want to live in, because nature repeats itself. So in Presbyterian Peace Fellowship, when we're thinking about decolonization, we're thinking about harm reduction strategies. In every interaction, conversation, programmatic decision, how are we working against our own colonizational tendencies, colonizer tendencies? So here's a few kind of more concrete examples. One is in language. So I feel a little bit iffy about the phrase "our partners," our partners in Colombia, our partners on the border. I think it's easy to understand that as trying to illustrate ownership, that these folks who are doing their own amazing work in these places are ours. And so instead, I often try to say the communities, for example, the communities in the Presbyterian Church of Colombia who host accompaniers, which is a much longer phrase that I often struggle with and feel discomfort with because it is not efficient. And so we have to recognize, I have to recognize, and in our organization, we have to recognize that efficiency is a value of white supremacy. And so we just have to, be okay with leaning into different ways. There's three key pieces that I would lift up that we try to do in our practice. One is to, as a person, as an organization with a colonizer identity for decolonizing. Okay. So one is to seek out and learn from, be led by, be taught by elders and experts from different cultural traditions, from places that are prefiguring decolonized relationships. So one example is the water protector camp at Standing Rock that invited some folks to come in and accompany them. So when appropriate for us who are socialized into colonization to join those spaces with humility, to learn new ways and get a peek outside the dome, to expand our imagination into different ways of being in the world. And the important nuance here is that this is not trying to outsource my own education to other people, to say that it is not the responsibility of people or peoples who have experienced oppression to educate me out of oppressing them. It is my own responsibility to take on information, and our organization's responsibility to do this work ourselves. A second piece is to orient toward consent as a key value in everything. So that starts from our Zoom tech shared at the beginning. If you don't want to be recorded, turn off your camera, and that is okay too. So from small things to the big things, like where do accompaniers go? And then the third thing is, as Tejan shared, the ongoing internal work on organizational and individual levels that we have to continue striving to walk upstream against the river of decolonization so that we're making change in ourselves and in the world.
Thanks so much, Alison. I love the Truman Show metaphor that you used. It's so powerful. And it's an age ago that I watched that movie, but yeah, thanks. And also for reminding us of all the other great things you said. I should mention that there's also a blog where you've reflected on Presbyterian Peace Fellowship's work at the border between Mexico and the US. And I have put a link to that blog piece onto the Lumio discussion board as well. So if you want to go there and kind of read a bit more about that daily struggle of putting into practice what Alison just suggested, that's a great piece as well. Okay, Martha, so I hand over back to you.
Great. Well, I have to say that I'm very thankful for listening to the panelists. So thank you very much for really sharing all those experiences, all these very important and hard questions to us, but also that illustrates how complex this topic is and diverse at the same time, but also how relevant the conversation is. So I think, well, right now we are going to move into the smaller group so that we can continue the conversations. So we are going to have 2 questions so that they will guide those discussions. So the first one is, what is the role of privilege in our work? And the second question is, what are we doing, or what could we do to decolonize our work at a practical level? So let's keep in mind these two questions for your discussions. And please, when you are in your groups, please find a volunteer who can take some notes and then post them in the chat later when we get together again. So I think we will have 20 minutes for that. And for those who need translation from English, please stay in this room, okay?
All right, I will now create breakout rooms, and could I get a confirmation from one of the facilitators on how large we would like each of these rooms to be? Do we say 5?
I mean, how many people in each room?
That's right.
Shall we say 5? I don't know.
Okay.
Yes, 5.
Why not?
Sure.
Let's say 5.
Yes.
Sure.
Yes, 5 is good.
All right, thank you. I'm creating the breakout rooms now. And a reminder, if you are an interpreter, or if you have selected a language that is not English for this workshop, you may disregard the invitation to a breakout room and stay in this room.
Okay, Martha, do you want to stay in this room, or do you want to
Yes.
move elsewhere? So then I can, just move, if you just send me to any other room, really. Austin,
Okay.
then,
Yeah, absolutely. I will get that sorted out right now.
and then if we can come back in 20 minutes, that would be great.
Yes.
We'll be a bit over time, but there we are.
Barrett, I just want to check that you've seen my messages. Unfortunately, I have to leave. Thank you all so much.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks,
Bye.
Shannon.
Thanks a lot.
No problem. Bye.
Bye.
So, Austin, hello, where are we? Because at certain point I was, my internet went off. So please, could you give me, yeah, where are we, please?
Sure,
Austin?
we just created breakout rooms,
Okay.
and this main room is also a discussion space. So you're welcome to stay in this room for the next just under 20 minutes for a discussion. I can reshare the questions that were posted in the chat just now.
Am I part of this group or there is not a group? Because I'm seeing here 12 participants.
My understanding, this main room is also a group. Martha, is this also? I mean, the main room, is there also discussion happening here?
Hello?
If you could assign me to one of their groups, please.
Sure. Martha, just to clarify, is this a discussion space as well?
Yes, this is a discussion space. I think that we agreed the people will stay here if they need a translation, right?
That's right. That's right. So I think we should be able to have the discussion in this space as well. I'm just here for the tech support, but Martha,
Sure.
is the discussion going to get underway?
Yes, of course. Okay, so how many people do we have here? So I can see Beatriz, Carlos, Ibrahim, Juan.
And I believe a handful of the folks here are interpreters, namely Juan,
Right.
Carlos, and Ibrahim. So there are a few of us who are not interpreters on the call. In this
Okay,
room.
good.
And I see that Beatrice has raised her hand.
Okay, so maybe, so is there any volunteer who wants to lead the discussion? So Austin, are you able to see how many people who are not translators are in this group?
Just on knowing who is the translators, or who are the translators, yes. There are 1, 2, 3. Yeah, it looks like, not counting myself, there are 3 individuals here who are not.
Okay, right. So maybe we can start the conversation. So, okay, so one of the questions is, what is the role of privilege in our work?
Hola Marta,
Hola.
¿cómo estás? Bueno,
Bien, bien, ¿tú?
cámara. Mi nombre es Beatriz. No, pues realmente yo quisiera referirme como en global a las dos preguntas y a la discusión y a lo que presentaron los compañeros y las compañeras ahorita en la discusión, y es pensar como también desde qué intersecciones pensar esa descolonización, que son múltiples, pero una de las cosas que me hizo pensar mucho la última intervención es que también hay muchas de ellas que nosotros no identificamos porque hemos naturalizado ciertas formas de integración. Por ejemplo, me parece que hoy todo el pensamiento queer nos está poniendo otras discusiones que, digamos, hace un tiempo no teníamos. Y creo que ese es un ejemplo claro de pensar que si bien hay categorías, digamos, muy identificadas como el término, digamos, las categorías de etnia, incluso la de género, quizás es una forma más dicotómica, pero ahí la hemos tenido también. Hay otra serie de categorías que yo creo que culturalmente y en cada contexto también se juegan en términos de relaciones de poder muy asimétricas y que quizás un papel que nosotros tendríamos que tener como acompañantes, y creo que eso ayer lo conversábamos en el taller de autoprotección, es identificar también en los contextos locales cuáles son esos elementos del contexto, situados, culturales, que hacen asimetrías de poder que quizás dentro de nuestras categorías más convencionales no vemos. Yo creo que ese es un reto. Pero lo otro que yo creo es que yo apuntaría a pensar que nuestra gran desafío es poder ver esas intersecciones tanto al interior del grupo de acompañantes como al interior del grupo de los acompañados, donde también se juegan esas categorías de asimetrías de poder y se naturalizan, y digamos con quienes son tomadores de decisión en esos contextos, porque también digamos que es en el juego entre todas esas relaciones donde se legitiman o se deslegitiman algunos. Entonces me parece que hay un reto muy grande que no se resuelve de una manera muy plana, sino que requiere como una mirada muy compleja y de muchos hilos que se tienden para muchos lados. Para mí el tema de la descolonización es el gran tema de la UCP. Bueno, puede ser porque soy colombiana y quizás desde mi lugar lo siento como un lugar necesario. Quizás de ser parte del sur global hace que se esas asimetrías, pero ese es como lo que quiero aportar a la discusión acá del taller. Muchas gracias.
Gracias, Beatriz, a ti también por tu contribución y también de Colombia, un placer. Okay, so is there anyone else in the room who would like to contribute?
But I think what our colleague just said right now, we didn't hear what exactly she was saying. I don't know whether there is possibility for someone just to, summarize what she said, if possible. Thank you.
Yes, sure. I think, okay, so Beatriz was sharing how complex is to have a very critical position and a critical overview to keep identifying those practices that are naturalized inside each organization, but also in those contexts that we interact with. And she was sharing that this is is always a very challenging approach to what is it that we are doing. And then she was also talking about the asymmetrical relations of power, being aware of it in our daily work. and also being able to identify those areas of intersection inside and outside of the organization, but also, I think I mentioned this before, in the context that each of us operate with when we provide accompaniments. And also she was also sharing that as Colombian, from the global South, she feels that very deeply, and that's my understanding. She felt that the decolonization discussion is pretty much embedded in being Colombian and being representative of the global South when doing this type of work. I think that's it. Would you like to contribute to a little bit, perhaps sharing some of your ideas?
Yeah, please. Could you remind me again the question, the first question, please?
Oh, yes. So the first question is, oh, sorry, just a minute. So what is the role of privilege in our work?
Yes, I think some of the privileges we have in our work. I'm going to give the example, the experience we have in West Africa. You know, when you look at the security, the peace and security landscape in West Africa, you know, especially nowadays has become very, very challenging. You can see in Nigeria, Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, who are confronted with the growing threat of violent extremism. And aside those countries, when you look like Guinea, Cote d'Ivoire, and just to mention those ones, you can see the growing threat of you know, dictatorship in the region. And some of the privileges we are having, you know, is people are getting to understand, you know, some of the things we are doing in terms of UCP. So I can see that in our region, especially where we are being involved, you see growing, you know, acceptance of some of the things we are doing, and also the involvement of young people, you know, we can see that. So, and the willingness, you know, to change, you know, some of the, you know, the undemocratic practices that we have, you know, experienced over the years. So, if I can put, like, to resume what I'm saying, is, you know, the acceptance of UCP by young people. You know, I think that is very critical. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So do you think that we can use the privilege of doing this type of work to get more acceptance in engaging youth?
Yes, I think engaging young people, you know, in our work in West Africa, you know, has been very productive, because now, you know, as I said, young people are, you know, becoming to understand some of the things we are, you know, our work. So always, you know, you see young people coming together, you know, to spearhead some of the non-violence methods, you know, across the region. I think for me is a privilege.
Great, thank you so much. Anybody else who would like to contribute? So what's the role of privilege in our work? Okay, so probably I can also share a little bit. So, and in the work that we do here in South Sudan, I think privilege in our work, well, it's always very contextual, but I think in South Sudan, the fact that we are part of and we represent an international NGO, it creates also opportunities to build relationships at so different levels, okay? So once we build those relationships with people who are influential in the community, so our presence has more acceptance, and the privilege is to build those relationships with those so that we can use them in order to prevent violence and protect others. I think we've also seen that, for example, communities that we work with, there is a lot of capacity and ways of dealing, responding, and preventing with violence, and that capacity is always there. But sometimes there are some challenges when it comes, for example, civilians in general engaging with authorities, engaging with the military, engaging with the, different, let's say, with other positions of power in the community. So I think our position as an international organization is actually to reach out to all those different actors that have a responsibility to protect civilians and facilitate that communication between communities that we work with and the authorities and other actors. So is that facilitation, that relationship building that we can use in order to create better conditions for communities to raise concerns, but also to work with authorities for them to be more responsive to what communities are raising. So it's an exercise of working with community, building relationships, and building trust among them. Okay, great. So
yes, I just wanted to mention this one. The institution where I work is a civil society organization, and just to mention some of the things we have been doing across the region. Like we have been accepted, because when you look at the West African Network for Peace Building, which is WANEP, we have our offices across the 15 countries of West Africa. And now, as I speak, we have more than 600 member organizations working at the grassroots level. So, these organizations are also trying to push some of the things we are, our ideologies and some of our focus. So just to tell you that, we have gotten that the acceptance, and wherever you go in West Africa, whenever you mention, one, either one or two organizations may identify themselves with what we are doing. So there is some of the privileges we have enjoying in West Africa when it comes to peace and security.
That's a very interesting one. Thank you so much.
We click
as I had mentioned just now in the chat, to everyone who has stayed in the main room, the participants who had gone off to separate rooms will now be joining over the course of the next about 30 seconds.
Okay, great. Thank you. So in case there is any last comment from anyone, otherwise we will go back to the main room. Okay, thank you, everybody.
Hi, everyone, back in the main room. How frustrating, right? You have 20 minutes to discuss something and then you get the 1 minute thing, and it's such a big question and there's just not enough time. I don't know whether any groups would like to share like a main point they discussed. Anyone? Don't be shy, raise your hand. Go ahead, Louise.
Yeah, I can feedback from our group. There was just two of us in our group, and Shannon and I, and we talked about privilege sometimes that exists within states when we're kind of dealing with politicians, people in power, and kind of the access that brings, but then the difficulties as well. And we also talked about the kind of privilege in research and ensuring that research is actually available and useful to people that have participated in it, rather than just kind of extracting knowledge and taking that away from communities as well.
Yeah, thank you. Anyone else? Any other groups? Just like a main point you talked about. Well, there was more than one group, I know that. Yeah, Tejan.
I think we talked quite a bit about a very basic, when we talked about privileges, a very basic starting point, that is that just by being involved in the work we do, just by being in a position where we go somewhere else to make peace or to support peace is in itself a very, very privileged positions where that means we are the norm, we are the example, the good example, and we go and support others to have peace, and what that means, and how do we in the first place think about this, or how do we ask ourselves questions about, well, why is that the situation? Am I even the right person? Is it because I am part of society or a group or an institution or whatever that maybe does things or do things that create these power imbalances, which makes me then the expert, or however I call myself, to go and do this, and what does that mean, and how much time do we take to reflect on this? I think that was where we started, and again later on we talked a little bit more about what can we do. And the question again is, it starts with us, because I think we are the structures, we are the system. If every one of us, unfortunately that's not the case, even those who are sitting here in this group were like the minority. But if every one of us, everybody, I don't care what you do, if we all will take this very seriously and are prepared to give up power and are prepared to address these inequalities, I think we might be able to affect these structures that are so entrenched. But unfortunately, that this willingness is not there, so it has to start with us. And we talked a lot about the difficulty and why is that difficult and stuff like that. But of course, there is hope, and the hope is an example of a forum like this where we exchange ideas to remind ourselves. I think most of what we are talking here is not new, but we are just reminding ourselves. And by reminding ourselves, we remind others, and others will remind others. And so, yeah, that was basically what we discussed. And at the end, Hilbert was in the process of explaining something. And then, like always, the time was not enough, and we had to be diverted to the main group. But yes, it was very interesting.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much. Sorry, and this is also why this needs to be continued, this conversation, because there isn't enough time in something so short. Anyone else from any other group who wants to report back? Anyone?
Yes. In our group, sorry, in our group, we discuss the question of money being one of the sources of power versus the projects that are being implemented. And the discussion centered more on the fact that those who provide funding for peace building projects, they sometimes enjoy more power because they provide funding, but they also provide some kind of rules on how this funding can be used. And we discussed actually a lot on this, and we thought if it is a question of accountability for the funding, then the local actors should be empowered in such a way that they can provide local accountability mechanism for funding, rather than the donors also providing money and also providing, ensuring that the money is properly accounted for. And by doing so, power will be shared between the donors who provide funding and the local communities who actually implement the project. So that's actually the summary of what we discussed.
Yeah, Yeah, I was in that group too, very much the power of the purse, which we discussed there. Anyone else? Was there any other group? Marta, what was happening in the group that was stayed in the room here?
Well, in our group, I think we were discussing about examples of how privilege can also enable protection. So, and then also we have a discussion on how important and how hard it is to keep always a critical perspective and to make sure that we are constantly questioning or denaturalizing those very dominant concepts that seem very normal but reinforces power disimbalances or very problematic concepts of privilege. And yes, I think that was more or less what we've discussed. Thank you.
Thank you. Any group that hasn't reported back? Don't be shy.
I'll just say our group, there was very similar topics, talking a lot about what are kind of the special assets that people come into this work with and how to use those resources and capacities and put systems in place that actually will start to undermine the colonizer kind of perspective and attitude. So yeah, it was a lot of kind of how do we challenge ourselves, being aware of those structures and how to offset them at a really practical level personally and then organizationally.
Yeah, thanks, Mana. Have we forgotten anyone? Anyone else? Any other group? I've lost kind of overview of how many groups we had. Okay, then let's close the session then. I'll try to do something and I hope it works, but it's a kind of an experiment. I think I have a direct link to this Lumio subgroup where we can continue our discussion. If this doesn't work, please look into your inbox. There should be an email from Jan Passion of how you register for Lumio, but this leads me directly to that subgroup. Let's see if it does with you. And there is, people are nodding, that's super. And there is, when you click on there, you will see the Decolonizing UCP and Accompaniment subgroup. Our questions that we talked about are there again. And there are only 2 threads here. One is called Getting Started on Thinking About Decolonization, Some Readings. And that's where you find the blog by Alison, for example, or the report that Shannon mainly authored, and a few other readings. And if you know of more, please upload them there. It's very easy to share things. You just put in the link and then others can read it as well. So I think to get us thinking about these things, there are a few readings there. And then the other one is called Let's Discuss. So if you have taken notes on this session in the different breakout groups, please go there and kind of put them there and please continue the discussion there. And the last thing I would like to ask or mention is, so think about how, I think there's no question that this topic needs to be addressed in the in-person meeting next year and beyond that. I think it's such an important topic that comes up all the time. I don't think we have to actually discuss whether we need to address it. But my question would be, how do we address it? So first step, how do we bring it into the in-person meeting? What do we want to do? Right? So it could be anything from having a session where we just continue discussing to bringing in an anti-racism trainer like Tejan to do work with us, of listening perhaps, or what is it that we want to do at that meeting? And is there something else you want to do? Are there people who want to volunteer for a working group on thinking about decolonizing accompaniment specifically, or is there something else? Can we have a code of practice on this, or what is it? So I'm just kind of bouncing around some ideas. I guess there are many more. So I would like to invite you to also share your ideas on where to go next, and maybe I just start a third thread under this subgroup to say, what are your ideas for the in-person meeting and beyond, how we can continue talking about this, not only in our own organizations, which is important, but also maybe as a community of people interested in the same thing. That would be great. So we do some brainstorming and then we take it from there. Does anyone want to add anything else or say anything else? Marta, otherwise I hand over to you for perhaps the the final words.
Thank you, Berit. Well, no, for me, it has been a very fruitful conversation, to be very honest. I think there are some, I was taking notes about different topics that came here, and there are questions that, you know, we need to really well answer. That's the hardest part, you know. So, and I guess there could be plenty of answers to one question, which I think is also part of the decolonize way of doing things. So, well, I just want to thank everybody for the contribution and for the interest in the group, and thanks, Berit, also for facilitating. Thank you.
Thank you too for co-facilitating, and thanks to our speakers. And yeah, see you soon. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.